Even though the Switch has had way more great original games than people give it credit for, one of the biggest things that'll end up defining the console's legacy will definitely be that it's had a poopload of ports of games from just about every notable era in history, except for one of the most popular eras of all time where the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 were running wild, aside from a few exceptions here and there, of course. And if you ask me, I think that's friggin' ridiculous. So yeah, grab yourself a glass of prune milk, press the subscribe button if you like games, goofs, and glory, and allow me, YouTube's strongest full-grown man, Cameron all one word, to tell you why there aren't more PS1 and 64 games on the Nintendo Switch, and why there should be. Alright, so a lot of people who grew up as gamers from the mid-90s through the early 2000s probably think of this era as one of, if not the best in video game history, but while I don't think that anybody could really argue that it was one of the most important eras, there are quite a few people who believe that most of these games aged worse than my stepkids did, and if I had to bet, then I'd say that a lot of the developers who actually made these games feel the same way, which is why so many of these classics aren't being re-released anymore. To be fair, most of the best N64 games either have some kind of licensing issues that make re-releases more trouble than they're worth, while the rest of them were made by Nintendo themselves. And like I explained in a recent video, they're just absolutely refusing to do anything with games from the 64, GameCube, and Wii, aside from Super Mario 3D All-Stars, of course. But the only reason they put that out is because the global pandemic ruined their plans for original Switch games in 2020, and they really just needed a quick and easy fix above all else. But even then, that compilation was always planned to be just yanked away from us after 6 months, which only proves that Nintendo's consciously holding back, although I don't think they're doing so because they're embarrassed of their older games or anything like that, but rather I just think they're trying to avoid overexposure, and as much as I hate to admit it, not having access to these games through the Switch or a 64 Classic Edition does make people want them way more than if they were just on the Switch's eShop from day one, which makes them much more effective for rainy days, as proven with Super Mario 3D All-Stars, or even as an incentive to get people to buy a Switch Pro upgrade, as lame as that'd be. Aside from all the first-party, licensed, and games Microsoft owns these days, though, most of the few remaining notable 64 games are in fact on the eShop because it's just a good idea to put them there, but as far as the PS1 and even Saturn and Dreamcast are concerned, though, there's so many games on the Switch's eShop that you just can't buy that I'm certain it'd sell out the ass, and I think it's because the developers for most of these games are just worried that people will be too critical of re-releases that might not have aged as well as other games have, and I'd rather people remember their classics fondly for a little while longer before remastering them when they're a bit more nostalgic. Like, sure, the Switch does have PS1 games like Final Fantasy 7 through 9 and Mega Man X's 4 through 6, but games like these were mostly built on foundations that were established during the 16-bit era. I mean, the Mega Man X games were obviously just 2D platformers with a few cutscenes thrown in here and there, and while the Final Fantasy games did let you move around in 3D, the games were mostly built around the battle systems that could have absolutely worked on the Super Nintendo, so aside from a few horrible mini-games here and there, there's really not too much about these games that haven't aged well, whereas a lot of other games like Resident Evil's 1 through 3 would be way harder for modern gamers to try to get into, especially with the updated remakes of 2 and 3 existing on other consoles, and even the GameCube remake of the first game that's on the eShop right now. Don't get me wrong, early 3D games definitely paved the way for all the modern classics you could play today, and hell, most of them still age like 1,000 times better than anything you'd find on the Atari 2600, since developers at the time at least had a pretty good general idea of what made games fun outside of the third dimension, but that one extra D really did change a whole lot in this time period and was insanely challenging for developers to try and figure out. I mean, 64 games are built with one analog stick in mind, and most PS1 games are built around the D-pad, despite most of them being in 3D, so the camera angles can be a huge pain in the booty to deal with if you've been spoiled with modern controls, and since most developers had no idea what they were doing at the time, there was a lot of experimentation and growing pains, much like with the NES era. And also like the NES, the new style of games the PlayStation 1 was going for were dramatically improved and sometimes even perfected in the very next generation, so I don't blame developers for prioritizing all those games first, because for some reason, people are a lot more forgiving early 8-bit games than they were with early 3D games, even though most early 3D games are a hell of a lot more fun to play in the modern day than early 8-bit games, if you ask me. Like, sure, the camera angles do kinda suck horse ass, and while the graphics are technically more complex, they still haven't aged nearly as well since they went for realism as opposed to the charm that the NES was going for. But still, though, I'll still take silly camera angles and blocky graphics over tedious and overly cryptic gameplay 9 times out of 10. I know that nobody really cared about early 3D games on the PS3 and 4 all that much, but for some reason, people eat just about anything up on the Switch, probably because of the whole hybrid concept. And even though some people might be a little bit of a dick when it comes to early 3D games on the eShop, I think most of us would embrace it and more of them started popping up here and there, and if you don't believe me, then just take a look at Turok's 1 and 2. Out of all the notable games from that era they could have put on the eShop, these two in particular are ones that I don't think hold up well at all, and I say this as someone who tried replaying Turok 2 not that long ago, but despite no real upgrades or improvements being made in the re-releases, people still ate these games up and overlooked all the flaws, despite the fact that they're $20 a pop.
You want one?
Oh yeah.
Okay, $20.
No, it's expensive.
Okay.
So when games from this era always seem to do so well in the eShop, you'd think that we'd see games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Metal Gear Solid, GTA's 1 and 2, Tomb Raiders 1 through whatever, Chrono Cross, Ogre Battle 64, Klonoa, Nights into Dreams, all the Tekken games, Legend of Dragoon, Time Cop 64, Gex, Silent Hill, and assloads of other pop up as well, but nope, not really. And you know what? I think that's such a big missed opportunity for everybody involved. And yeah, I know that the PlayStation Mini failed miserably, but we all know that that had everything to do with Sony botching it to the high heavens and nothing to do with people not being interested in the games. Again, though, don't get me wrong, the main priority should always be for developers to release new games on the Switch first, but like, ports are still awesome too, and for games this old, it's not even like it takes a whole lot of effort to make them happen anyway, so I think it's just plain silly that there aren't more of them on the eShop, or even on physical cartridges for that matter, because I guarantee that people would jump all over them, especially during a partial game drought caused by that whole pandemic thingy or whatever it's called, mainly for nostalgic purposes, sure, but I think there'd be way more people who'd be pleasantly surprised at these games and enjoy them for what they are than there would be people causing a scene over the flaws that come with aging and overall progress in gaming. I don't know, maybe I'm just a dingus though. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody at some point. If you liked this video though, then you might like my video explaining why Nintendo refuses to put 64, GameCube, and Wii games on the Switch, outside of the reluctant and limited edition 3D All-Stars release, of course. That's all for now though, so if you'll excuse me, I've gotta go feed my stepdad. Later.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.